Hi, everyone, and it's welcome back to our Facebook Live events and our series on the true history of Constantinople. A shout out to National Geographic. We're very fortunate and thrilled, actually, to have Professor Alexandros Kyrou from Salem State University join us, a good friend, a longtime friend of HALC's. He is a professor of Byzantine, Balkan, and Ottoman history at Salem State University, and the director of the program on Russian and Eastern European studies. Professor Kyrou, welcome. Kalianastasi.
Kalianastasi, Andy, it's good to see you. And thank you for this invitation. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
As am I, and many more discussions that we have. I'll do a little teaser trailer without telling people, but we got a whole plan, a year-long worth of programming with Professor Kyrou that come October, you guys are going to see a real high point, but that's just a little teaser trailer. Today, we're talking about the fall of Constantinople. I trolled a little bit National Geographic just now. Of course, those of you who are following may remember that 2 weeks ago, we engaged in a large-scale protest on National Geographic's history of Constantinople, where they said Constantinople fell in 1299 and indigenous Ottoman Turks replaced the Greeks and the Romans. Obviously, that was all wrong. Fortunately, they took it down. But we're going to hear a little more about this story, but not in the way you guys think. Professor Kyrou, as a precursor, if people want to read the full history of the fall of Constantinople, we can give them a reading list, right? I always start with Brunson and the fall of Constantinople. But do you have any, before we get to your specifics, do you have any suggestions on a reading list?
Well, Andy, I'd be happy to offer a list of authors, titles, sources. Historians obsessed with are delighted with the prospect of talking about scholarship and books. So thanks for beginning the conversation on that very subject. In terms of an overall broad introduction to Byzantine studies and Byzantine history, to kind of set the ground for a more detailed look at the fall of Constantinople, 1453, I'd urge people to look at a wonderful book, now in multiple reprints, by Timothy Gregory, a professor of Byzantine history at Ohio State University. He published a wonderful book several years ago. It's simply entitled A History of Byzantium. For the period that most concerns our discussion today, the fall of 1453, before getting to that point, in terms of more specific background, the centuries immediately before the fall, I'd recommend the work of an English scholar, David Nicol. It's entitled The Last Centuries of the Byzantine Empire. The title of the work is self-identifying in terms of its topic. Another Nicol, spelled Nicole instead of Nicol like Donald, is the author of a work, The Immortal Emperor, the Life and Legend of Constantine Palaiologos, the Last Roman Emperor. That is a wonderful book, and it situates the fall in its chronological setting, and it tells us the history of the fall and how the fall is remembered and commemorated after the fall through the person and the stories that surround the legendary Constantine XI. For the fall itself, 1453, there was a wonderful book published just a couple of years ago by an English writer, Roger Crowley. I know you know this work, Andy. It's 1453, The Holy War for Constantinople. You mentioned Stephen Runciman, his classic book that dates to its publication in 1957. It's still in print. I use it as a standard source in my own Byzantine history course. And that's Stephen Runciman, the great prolific, the giant of Byzantine studies of the 20th century, Scottish-English scholar. The Fall of Constantinople, 1453. It's a moving, powerful, and rigorous work. Some of my students have reported that it's actually brought them to tears. That's how powerful a writer Runciman is. For those in the audience who are interested specifically in the military dimensions of the siege, there is an incredibly detailed and thorough work published by a now retired, a professor emeritus from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, Marios Philippidis. And that is, if memory serves, the siege and fall of Constantinople in 1453. And another work, not by Donald Nicol, but by David Nicol, is Constantinople, 1453. I'd also suggest maybe not beginning studies on 1453 with this category of work, but perhaps consulting it after you've immersed yourself in Byzantine studies. I'm going to give you the titles of a couple of sources. By sources, I mean primary sources, the accounts of the fall of Constantinople by those who witnessed it and were close to it and were actors in the fall. The Byzantine historian, simply known as Doukas, D-O-U-K-S, he wrote a book entitled The Decline and Fall of Byzantium to the Ottoman Turks. A Byzantine court historian to Constantine Palaiologos, George Sfranzis, The Fall of the Byzantine Empire. For the official Turkish history of the fall of Constantinople, written by a Turkish court historian. This is an interesting work. It was written by the Ottoman historian Tursun Beg, Turcunbeg, and it's the history of Mehmet the Conqueror. It's a very hagiographic work. It celebrates the accomplishments of Mehmet II, the man who would conquer Constantinople.
And that may be a great transition point
Let's make
here. You know, I first of all, thank you for that recommendation. And now people are getting a sense of Professor Kyrou's classes on Byzantium and Ottoman history at the university. But today we're going to tackle a specific part of the legacy, I think, kind of 1453 and the fall of Constantinople. You've entitled this session, The Fall of Constantinople in Turkey's Imagined History. What is this implying? What are you trying to get to with this title?
Well, thank you for that very perceptive question. I appreciate it. And fact of the matter is that title is intended to be juxtaposed against the title that you've assigned to this week's series of lectures, which I thought to be brilliant. And of course, what I'm referring to is your title, The Real History of Constantinople. And I appreciate that kind of candor in your approach to how we must frame history. There has been in the last 30, 40, 50 years a tendency within historical writing to emphasize those aspects of historical scholarship which look at how history has, quote unquote, been constructed, suggesting that historical knowledge is not only highly subjective, which I think we can all concede, but that it has in many ways been quite deliberately manufactured to produce certain narratives, and that those narratives often have very little connection to the actual factual historical past. Well, I appreciate what you're doing and what HALC is doing, because one of the missions you've committed yourself to is offering, when appropriate and necessary, correctives to imaginary historical narratives. Of course, the problem is for those who do promote the rigor of deconstructing fanciful historical narratives, that they themselves often in the process produce their own historical narratives, which are no less and sometimes even more remotely connected to historical factual record than those other narratives they attack. And what one sees, I think, in particular in Ottoman studies and in Ottoman history, and as a byproduct in the studies that only tangentially deal with the Ottoman Empire, is a new kind of history. One that's very different than a more traditional historical narrative that had been shaped in our approach to Ottoman studies in the past, and one that is remarkably not only imaginative in its own way, but aggressively apologist. And so I want to thank you for using the label real, and I thought to incorporate imagined to reverse how that label is often applied to people who work on Ottoman studies.
And I think you nail an important point right here. You just a few minutes ago you were telling us about primary sources and Dugas and the history, but now your title and what you're talking about, the imagined history, you're talking about a contemporary consequence, maybe even a policy coming out of the Erdogan regime. Okay. Historians sometimes are not as concerned about what's happening right now or can't connect the dots, but you have. What sparked your interest in this? Because it wasn't too long ago that everybody thought that Erdogan was the great modernist, the reformer. Everybody loved him. People were sending their kids to study there.
Right.
You clearly caught something early on to develop this particular expertise. What was it?
Well, first of all, thank you. I don't know if I'd call my approach to what I'm working on here a function of expertise. It is a function of interest and critical interest. And you're absolutely right. What I'm interested in here and where I hope our discussion goes today is around how the fall of 1453 is remembered. 1453 has long been commemorated in the Greek world and parts of the West as well. But we really have never looked at how Turkey and the Turks remember and have commemorated the fall of Constantinople in 1453. And that's changed over time. And how it's being used today, how that history has been reimagined by Erdogan and his party, the Justice and Development AKP party, is at the center of my interest here. But if I might, to answer your question specifically, what sparked my interest in this subject, I can give you a formal answer, and I can give you an informal and real answer. The formal
Give us a real one. Give us a real one.
Well, first I'll give you a formal one. Formally, I would say, if I were speaking to a group of other historians, I'd say that I've always been interested in the changing narratives in Ottoman historiography, how the West specifically approach and understanding to the Ottoman Empire has changed over time. And we can see reflections of that approach found in how Western scholars have understood commemoration of the fall of Constantinople in 1453 in the Ottoman Empire, and how it's changed significantly over the last century. But personally, I have a small story I'll share with you, Andy. The first time I found myself in Istanbul, first time I visited Turkey, was at the turn of the century in 2001. And I arrived in Constantinople, I arrived in Istanbul the last week of May. I hadn't really thought about what was approaching, May the 29th. I was quite disoriented being in Istanbul. It was a very unusual experience for me, having studied a place for as long as I had, and finally finding myself in that location. But I found it very difficult to adjust to the new time, and I was disoriented by jet lag. I didn't realize what day it was, what the date was, but in the very early morning of May the 29th, I woke up. My wife and daughter who were with me were sleeping. And so I thought, how can I just kill some time? And I decided I'll turn the television on and see if I can find CNN Turk or something else and get some news in English. I couldn't find anything. And I came upon a Turkish cartoon. I switched the channel. There was another Turkish cartoon on another channel. There were Turkish cartoons everywhere. And I realized on all of these channels, this same cartoon was being broadcast. I don't speak Turkish. I don't understand Turkish, but it was a cartoon. It was very elemental in what it was communicating to the viewer. And what it was telling, and the audience was obviously intended for children, it was telling them the story of the fall of Constantinople. And I found it interesting that Mehmet II was depicted as of course, very young, robust, vigorous, and honorable man. That all came across. Constantine XI was presented as old, broken, a villainous figure, swarthy, hook-nosed. And I thought to myself, where have I seen this kind of imagery? And I realized I've seen this kind of imagery in the work that some of my colleagues are involved in, namely the racist depiction of European Jewry in interwar Nazi Europe. I watched the program, and everything I had seen that one would associate with hate art in authoritarian regimes, I saw in this program, which told some very interesting stories. And what I came away with was an understanding, even with the language barrier before me, that what the Turks were doing in 1453 was liberating Constantinople and the long-suffering enslaved Turkish Muslim peoples of Constantinople from this brutal, evil, venal Greek rule. And I thought to myself, this is brilliant. This is 2001. And this is a message being communicated to children. And that made me realize the way things are commemorated in Turkey are commemorated in a very unique way relative to the rest of the world in 2001.
Yeah, and 2001 is clearly, just before Erdogan comes into power. Yeah. But from the time of Ataturk on, there have been attempts in Turkey to refashion history. And obviously, because you're an expert in the Balkans, too, we have competing narratives around many dates. Sure. What we call the catastrophe, Turkey calls the War of Independence. But let's really look at 1453. And what do you think is the significance of not only Turkey commemorating the fall, but this new narrative that they're trying to construct around the fall of Constantinople?
Well, the way states, the way nations engage in historical commemoration has always been fluid. It's changed over time, and it's often changed according to the needs or the objectives of a given culture or a specific state. And we can see how that has affected the portrayal, the remembrance, the commemoration of 1453 in Turkey. There's a direct correlation between the state in which the Turkish state finds itself and that state's needs and objectives, and how that's translated into public commemoration, into official public history, and then in turn into popular memory. In the case of Turkey, we see considerable change over time, and I suspect we'll probably talk about that in a while. But this isn't unusual. Turkey is like any other country in the sense that as a nation state, it has historical moments in time that it sets aside for commemoration to reinforce identity, to reinforce purpose. What's problematic, however, about the way that Turkey commemorates history today is that it has been folded into both a domestic policy set of objectives and, more troubling, a foreign policy vision for Turkey, specifically under the AKP and Erdogan, that has implications beyond Turkey's frontiers. Obviously, every state, every people are free. They have the prerogative to celebrate, to commemorate their own histories as they see fit. However, the way that Turkey today under Erdogan celebrates 1453 is as a function of Turkey's, I should say, the Erdogan government's regime's use of 1453 for political and revisionist purposes in the region. And the way 1453 is commemorated today as part of a political and foreign policy agenda for Turkey, that's something that's incompatible with international law, and it's ultimately a threat to regional stability.
Can you give us a little point of reference, because you made reference to the way that this commemoration in Turkey has changed over time. Given what you're saying, and I think you're making a tie to what is popularly called Erdogan's neo-Ottoman foreign policy. How was 1453 treated pre-Erdogan?
Very differently than it is today. It has a history as old as the empire itself, or at least as old as the conquest of Constantinople. It's interesting to note that throughout most of the Ottoman Empire's history, virtually the whole of the Ottoman Empire's history, the fall of 1453 was not much celebrated. Inasmuch as not much celebrated, I mean, wasn't celebrated very much as a public commemoration. It was decidedly a privileged dynastic celebration. Beginning in 1454, the year after the Ottoman conquest, there was a celebration in Constantinople and at the gates of Constantinople, where the Turks first breached the walls, the Theodosian walls. But from 1453, 1454 onward, that is up to the age of nationalism, up to the period of Turkish national identity formation, the fall of Constantinople was not commemorated as a national holiday. There were, in effect, no national holidays. There was no Turkish nation, per se, in the Ottoman Empire. Of course, there were Turks, but that's another issue. Instead, the commemoration was a solemn, almost religious commemoration. And it was conducted by, and the participants in the celebration were Ottoman elites. We see the imperial state elite, the Islamic religious establishment, being the chief participants in this celebration. The state elites, the Osmanli class, as the Ottomans knew them, and the religious establishment, the ilmiye or ulama, were really the only people who participated in this commemoration. And why they, and not throngs of Ottoman, Turk, and other Muslim subjects? Precisely because, as I said, this was a celebration intended for dynastic grandeur. It was intended to communicate that the conquest of Constantinople marked the Ottoman dynasty as it marked the primacy of the Ottoman dynasty's position among all Muslim states and Muslim rulers. And that was something that was punctuated by the transfer of the caliphate from Egypt, from Cairo, to Constantinople in the 16th century. And the position of the caliph, of course, was invested in the person and throne of the sultan. But again, this was a essentially small and elite commemoration. In 1908, that changed. In 1908, Turkish nationalists, in the form of what we commonly call the Young Turks, of course, staged their revolution, seized power, and beginning in 1909, they co-opted what had been a small, elite, privileged celebration into really for the first time in Ottoman history, a large-scale public commemoration. Why? They saw 1453 in very different terms than had the Ottoman dynasty. When the Young Turks seized power over the Ottoman Empire, yes, it remained the Ottoman Empire. Yes, there still was a sultan, but he was a figurehead. Instead, this group of ultra-nationalist Turkish military officers and intellectuals, they held the reins of power and government. And they determined that public commemorations were crucial to promoting their primary objective, Turkification, the creation of Turkish national identity, the promotion of Turkish nationalism. And so 1453, for the first time, became a publicly celebrated event among Turkish Muslim peoples. And that would change in time as well. The commemoration took on particular punctuated meaning during the First World War. It was an opportunity to promote patriotism and the war effort as much as a mechanism for building Turkish national identity. In the first 3 decades of the Turkish, what we commonly call Republic, from 1923 to 1953, the commemoration begins to seed into the public background. Annual commemorations do take place, but they're relatively subdued. There's greater emphasis on what the Turks come to call Independence Day, October 29, that being the day when the Turkish Republic, the Kemalist Republic, was formally established to supplant the Ottoman dynastic system. Why do I mention 1953 as a different point of hallmark? For all the obvious reasons. That commemorated 500 years of the conquest. And in Kemal having passed in the mid-30s and the Kemalist system still being firmly in place, the Kemalist system, which subordinated and controlled the place of religion in public life, sought to make a concession to the religious establishment by doing what it could not avoid, ignoring the 500-year anniversary. And so turning planning essentially over to the religious establishment and some small commission, a 10-day-long celebration marked the anniversary in 1953. But, Andy, I might surprise you, and I might surprise our audience too, when I tell you that that was not the biggest celebration that took place in Turkey in 1953. In fact, that 10-day celebration in Istanbul, commemorating the fall of Constantinople, did not even draw the presence, the participation of either Turkey's president or prime minister. Huh. So that should tell you something about how the Kemalist regime viewed commemoration of 1453. What do you think drew the participation of both president, prime minister, the entire parliament, virtually every major national dignitary in Turkey? In 1953, in 1953, Kemal's gigantic, colossal, mammoth mausoleum was dedicated and opened on September the 1st. And that drew more public attention, more celebration than had the 500-year anniversary. That was for many years after, too, the norm for how 1453 was treated. As religion began to re-enter the space slowly and incrementally in Ottoman society, not yet state, but society, more and more attention, more and more public focus was given to commemoration. And that was catapulted forward in 1997. In 1997, Necmettin Erbakan, a kind of political precursor to Erdogan, the leader of the Islamist, short-lived, Islam-oriented, I should say, Islamist-oriented welfare party came to power. And Erbakan made a point of celebrating the fall of Constantinople in 1453 on a mammoth scale. In fact, that was one thing that made the Kemalists very uncomfortable. And then, of course, I think what we can talk about in length is what we see beginning with the turn of the century, and specifically gaining momentum year from year after 2002, when Recep Erdogan becomes Turkey's state leader, when the Justice and Development Party becomes the dominant party in Turkish politics, when what you, I think, correctly identified as a neo-Ottomanist agenda begins to incrementally unfold. Now it's obvious, can no longer be denied. It's when Turkey begins to enter into its kind of post-Kemalist period, where the legacy of the Ottoman Empire has been reimagined in a way to serve this neo-Ottoman ambition. And we can talk about that.
So it seems that the fall of Constantinople, kind of like the cartoon that you alluded to before, you're telling us about how the Young Turks used it, and then Erbakan and Erdogan, and it seems those are three tipping point in terms of constructing or reconstructing Turkish national identity. That's an internal and domestic debate. What seems to have changed in Erdogan's strategy is the soft power attempts to project this new history of 1453 externally. And I want to open up for questions, and I'll use this opportunity to kind of do a question from the audience plus me. In one of our previous segments, Drake Barakis asked about the Netflix documentary about 1453. We also believe that the National Geographic mistake, just because on the internet there's really no obvious place to find that Ottomans were indigenous to Constantinople or this 1299 date. So that seems a narrative that was pushed from somewhere, and that we're thinking from Turkey. Talk to us a little bit about this soft power attempt to worldwide create a new history of 1453.
The soft power, and I would add too, quite recently, given Turkey's involvement in the Syrian civil war, its efforts to become increasingly involved in the Libyan civil war, we see the realization of, yes, this neo-Ottoman vision. One of the intellectual originators of this neo-Ottoman vision was, for quite some time, Erdogan's foreign policy minister, Ahmet Davutoglu. And he coined a phrase not long after being appointed foreign minister that I think perfectly encapsulates that vision. It's a very loaded phrase for those people who are familiar with Ottoman history in the region, historical and present. But when asked to summarize Turkey's foreign policy ambitions, to make sense of this neo-Ottoman vision, Davutoglu summed it up in the phrase, from Sarajevo to Baghdad. That can be interpreted in many ways. One extreme interpretation involves territorial revisionism. Some people might scoff at that idea, but if one considers Turkey's ongoing revisionism, occupation of Cyprus, its rejection of the established international border between itself and Greece and the Aegean, its long and troubling history of contempt for the territorial sovereignty of virtually all of its neighbors, that's something that cannot be dismissed. By the same token, from another perspective, on the opposite end of the spectrum, one might see this as simply Turkey's vision for the creation of a new sphere of influence. Well, that's all well and good. Perhaps that doesn't involve, territorial revisionism and violence. But the fact of the matter is that kind of territorial soft revisionism, the creation of a sphere of influence, take into account the wishes and the rights of the people beyond Turkey's borders who would make up part of that sphere of influence.
Yeah.
And inasmuch as the fall of Constantinople and the new Turkish narrative that has developed around its commemoration has been folded into the justification and rationale for why this vision is a matter of historical destiny for Turkey and gives purpose to Turkey's foreign policy ambitions, how Turkey's commemoration of historical events matters, precisely because it spills out into the region.
Yeah, we're going to get to, for over the last few minutes, we have several questions. I'm going to start with one from Dino Jerusis, because it alludes to the changing narratives over time that you talked about. Turkish propaganda has been used to deadly consequence, from the Istanbul pogroms to calling Kurds mountain Turks. How has this propaganda changed or may become worse under Erdogan, who at the outset of his regime right? At the outset of coming to power, everybody was like, oh, he's going to be better for the Armenians, he's going to be better for the Kurds, and he's going to be better for the Orthodox, to the point that, the Greek Americans were honoring his ministry or his ministers. How has it changed under Erdogan?
Well, first of all, Andy and Dino, both of you are right. There was great hope, great expectation when Erdogan first came to power in 2002 that we would see the initiation of a genuine move toward pluralism in Turkey, an open, free civil society, and the final realization of what is, in the official language of Turkish history, now an almost century and a half long process of quote unquote democratization, the longest process of democratization in world history. All of those things have gone absolutely not only nowhere, they've gone in reverse. Because as Erdogan has consolidated his power, and as the AKP has consolidated its domination over Turkish political culture and society, the Islamist agenda, marked in terms of its foreign policy dimensions with this neo-Ottoman drift, has proven to be more austere than anything that preceded it. Now, I'm going to do here, Andy, with your indulgence and the audience's indulgence,
of course,
do something that no one should ever do during a live interview. I'm going to read to you because there's just a brief excerpt from an incredible work of scholarship by a Canadian scholar, Gavin D. Brockett, one of Canada's rising Ottomanists, where he, in very precise language, communicates precisely what this narrative involves and how detached it is from Western understanding of the fall of Constantinople and our own imagined assumptions and perception of how Turkey sees the past. I'll try to be very quick here, but I wanted to share this with you so that the audience understands that what I'm communicating to them is a matter of debate within the scholarly community. This is not simply my perspective or if you will, opinion. This is a rigorous dialogue that's taking place among people who are serious in their approach to the very intimate and increasingly troubling relationship between Turkish historical studies and Turkish political realities today. If I might, Dr. Brackett writes, quote, the Turkish narrative stakes a claim to 1453 as the pivotal event in world history. It explicitly refutes the long-standing European notion that the fall of Constantinople spelled disaster for the civilized European world. On the contrary, Turkish public memory imagines that prior to 1453, the history of Christian Europe had been characterized by violence, bloodshed, ignorance, fanatical reaction, and bigotry. Understood in this context, the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople, in fact, paved the way for Europe to escape itself, to escape these problems and to progress along the path to religious reform, enlightenment, and ultimately the emergence of individual nations. The Turkish nation, from its inception, a beacon of tolerance, had pursued rational knowledge alongside religious faith, and its triumph in 1453. It initiated a process of cultural interchange that was essential to the future success of Western civilization. In short, the conquest of Constantinople was not so much a military triumph as a victory for all of humankind, resulting in the spread of freedom and equality throughout Europe. Now, this is not Professor Brockett's view. This is his deconstruction of this now dominant Turkish narrative on the meaning and the importance of the fall of Constantinople. This is why in Turkey, unlike the rest of the world that also, in many places, has an imperial past, this is why in Turkey the celebration of empire is not problematic. France, Britain.
This is a narrative to get, because there's a question on this, Ioanna Panos Morris. This is a narrative that is taught actively in schools, yes, at all levels.
Of course.
How about, this is a question from Peter Corbakis, is this a narrative that's also being pushed through the Turkish-controlled charter schools. We know that most of those charter schools are Gulenist, and now there's a difference between the state and the Gulenists. But the Gulenists were part of Erdogan's rise and part of this soft power too. Is this a narrative in those charter schools?
Andy, I'm happy to answer those very thoughtful questions. Yes, this is Turkey's official history and its official understanding of the fall of Constantinople in 1453, which is not a fall, it is a liberation. And yes, this is something that's promoted in throughout Turkish education, not just at the elemental levels, but in higher education as well. There are 3 universities in Istanbul, which by their very appellation, by their very name, commemorate the conquest of Constantinople. There is, first of all, Conquest University, if you can imagine. There is a university in Turkey called Conquest University. Then there's the Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror University, and then there's 29 May University. These 3 institutions form a consortium that produces literature for consumption at all levels to influence Turkish culture and to commemorate the fall of Constantinople in this way. But even without those institutions, this is a dominant view, and it was a view common within the Ottoman Empire in the late medieval and early modern period. It faded from discussion. It was essentially forgotten, but it's been revived now under the Erdogan regime. And so you understand what Erdogan is telling us, what this narrative is promoting, is the notion that, yes, there was an Ottoman Empire, but there was not Ottoman imperialism, because Ottoman conquest was not tantamount to subjugation or control of foreign peoples. It was, in fact, a means to liberate those peoples from their superstitious, Christian, backward-looking, intolerant histories and cultures, to introduce them into a world of equality, openness, freedom, and liberation. And that is how Erdogan can reconcile, that's how Turkish ultranationalists can reconcile the otherwise very problematic history we associate with all imperial experiences, and a commitment to revive a new kind of Ottoman future for the region. And this also situates Turkey in a place that is very important for Ottoman in his political narrative, in his political rhetoric. Specifically, the Ottoman Empire has a destiny that is yet to be fulfilled. Its destiny is as a world power. Its destiny involves being the leading state within the Muslim community of nations. And the narrative of 1453, Muhammad himself, Islam's prophet Muhammad, had prophesied, we're told, that he who would conquer Constantinople in his time, that great, grand, coveted Christian center, the epicenter of Christian civilization in the Middle Ages, that he who would conquer Constantinople and his army would be the preeminent ruler of the world. Now, of course, Erdogan, I would imagine, doesn't take that literally, but he takes that and his own ambitions seriously. And in as much as 1453 fuels that argument and fire, it has consequences. As I said from the onset of our discussion, it has consequences, and troubling ones, for international law and for stability in the region and beyond.
We're going to wrap up here. There are several foreign policy questions, but the people who are asking them, I'm going to ask them to bring them to the table tomorrow, because we are going to be going right back to that very house to talk to the amazing Dr. Elizabeth Prodromou.
You have Elizabeth Prodromou speaking tomorrow?
Yes.
She's terrific. You'll enjoy the conversation.
That's got to be a nightly. It's got to be a nightly think tank over there. But there are a couple last questions on history. One, the excerpt you read, who is the author? Do we have a question about that?
I have it right here. I'll get it for our friend who's asking the question. The author is Gavin D. Brockett. He's a Canadian historian. And this is from a book.
The guy who asked it is Canadian, too. So there you go, Evan.
This is from, it may have appeared in many places up to this point, but it's from a work forthcoming. This will be in a book he'll be publishing on Turkish commemoration of history.
So the last question, which is actually asked very early on, but it was not about the Turkish remembrance of Constantinople, but very much kind of one of the Greek versions. Andrew Pagonis asks of the story that the morning of the fall, there was a cloud over Hagia Sophia, and it appeared that the Holy Spirit was leaving the city and going to heaven. Is that, can you reference where that story emanates from?
There are many such visions that are reported surrounding the day, the morning of the fall, and the days, in particular evenings before the fall. I would urge Andreas to look at one of the books I mentioned earlier, the most recently published major publications on the fall, Roger Crowley's book on the fall, the 1453, The Holy War for Constantinople. He dedicates a chapter in that book to discussing these very subjects. And he links them to natural physical occurrences in the world. He does not dismiss these visions, but he offers a critical material explanation for some. And of course, he places others in the world of tragedy, loss, and imagination.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the reading list. Thank you for the fascinating conversation. I think it's particularly important given what we saw with regard to the National Geographic situation, because we can't just dismiss that as bad research. Somebody is pushing such a narrative, and there are obvious consequences for such a narrative to be pushed, including Peter Courbekis asked a question about the consequences for the religious minorities in Turkey, but that's the subject of tomorrow's conversation with Dr. Prodromou. Professor Kyrou, thank you very much. We look forward to having you again. Maybe we'll read one of those books, including the one you just mentioned, together and have you for a more detailed conversation about the full story of 1453. You're always welcome, and thanks for being such a great friend. And Kali Anastasi.
Kali Anastasi. Thank you very much, Andy. The pleasure's been all mine.
All right. See the rest of you tomorrow.
Take care now. Bye-bye.